The morning sun cast a hazy, humid glow over Stone Mountain, Georgia, on Saturday, May 20th, 1995. Summer had arrived early, thick and heavy, blanketing the small community in a familiar warmth. Inside the modest parsonage on Memorial Drive, Reverend Elias Washington sat at his dining room table, his wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he studied his Bible. The sharp scent of brewing coffee mixed with the sound of his wife, Seraphina, humming softly in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the children. Elias was a man of profound conviction. His congregation at the New Hope Baptist Church knew him as righteous, charismatic, and unwavering in his interpretation of the Word. At home, these same qualities manifested as unbending rules. Curfews were covenants, chores were duties, and on this particular morning, the subject of prom had already exhausted his patience. Marcus appeared in the doorway, still in his basketball shorts and a faded t-shirt. He was 17, with a quiet intensity, caught in the frustrating space between boyhood and the man he was expected to become. His hair was cut in a neat fade, but his eyes held a restless energy that had been simmering for months. "Dad, can we talk about tonight?" Marcus's voice was low, respectful. He had long since learned that confrontation only built walls. Elias looked up from his scripture, his gaze already firm. "We have discussed this, Marcus." Marcus hated when his father used his full name. It felt like a judgment, a reminder that he was his father's son before he was his own person. "I know, but everybody's going. It's prom. It's not just some party, it is a worldly event that invites temptation." Elias interrupted, closing his Bible with deliberate finality. "And you have not shown me that your spirit is strong enough to resist temptation lately." Seraphina glanced over her shoulder, her expression a mix of love and worry. She was the family's gentle center, the one who tried to cushion the hard edges between her husband and her son. "Elias, maybe we can." "Seraphina, please." Elias's tone wasn't cruel, but it was absolute. Marcus's jaw tightened. He wanted to shout, to argue, to make his father see him as more than just a soul to be saved. But he held the words back. "I'll be responsible. I promise." Elias studied his son for a long, heavy moment. Then he nodded, but the terms were swift and non-negotiable. "You may attend. But you will be home by midnight. Not a minute past. And you will check in with your mother before you leave." Marcus let out a slow breath, the relief visible on his face. "Okay. Thank you, sir." Elias returned to his Bible. The conversation was over. Seraphina offered Marcus a small, supportive smile as she set a plate of grits on the table. In the living room, Amara and Chloe giggled at a cartoon, their bright, innocent voices a stark contrast to the tension that had just passed. Later, members of the congregation would try to piece together that morning. They described the Washington home as devout and loving, a place where faith was the cornerstone of daily life. Some said Elias's discipline was born from a deep, abiding love. Others whispered it was born from fear that the world, especially the world outside their black community, was waiting to corrupt his children if he ever let his guard down. Marcus's friends remembered something different. They remembered his frustration, the quiet way he talked about feeling trapped, about living under a microscope. One friend would later tell investigators that Marcus had seemed distant in the days leading up to prom, as if he was carrying a weight he couldn't share. But on that Saturday morning, it was all just family life. Parents set rules, teenagers chafed against them, and life moved forward. It was ordinary. It was normal. It was the last normal day the Washington family would ever know. By the afternoon, the house had shifted into a different gear. Marcus stood in his room, meticulously pressing his rented tuxedo and laying it across his bed. The sharp black and white seemed out of place in his room, too grown up. He stared at it for a moment, then began to dress. Downstairs, Seraphina was preparing an early dinner. Elias had retreated to his study to finalize his Sunday sermon. The girls played in the backyard, their laughter drifting through the open windows. Marcus came down the stairs just before 5 p.m., his bow tie slightly askew. Serafina emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes softening when she saw him. "Oh, you look so handsome," she said, her voice warm. Marcus managed a rare, genuine smile. "Thanks, Ma." She stepped forward to fix his tie, her touch gentle. "Your father loves you, you know. He just wants you to be safe." Marcus didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say. In this house, love and control always felt like the same thing. Elias appeared from his study, his expression unreadable. "Remember. Midnight." "I know, Dad." "And Marcus." Elias paused, his gaze locking with his son's. "Make choices that honor this family tonight." Marcus just nodded. The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken. A friend's car horn honked outside. Witnesses would later recall seeing Marcus leave the house around 5:30 p.m. He seemed tense, they said, quieter than usual. One friend mentioned that Marcus paused by the car for a moment before getting in, as though he'd forgotten something or was debating going back inside. But he didn't go back. He got into the passenger seat, and the car pulled away from the curb. Behind him, the parsonage stood quiet in the fading Georgia light. Inside, Serafina finished dinner. Elias returned to his sermon. The girls chased each other down the hall, their voices bright. The house was full of life. In just a few hours, it would be full of silence. Stone Mountain High's gymnasium was a sea of maroon and gray streamers. A DJ spun R&B hits from a corner stage, the bass vibrating through the floor. Laughter echoed. Disposable cameras flashed. The air was thick with the smell of perfume and hairspray. Marcus arrived just after 6 o'clock. Classmates greeted him, teasing him about the tux. He moved through the crowd with a practiced social grace, smiling and nodding, but never fully present. He danced, posed for a few pictures, and made conversation that felt hollow. And then, around 7:30 p.m., he was gone. Several students noticed his absence. One girl, a friend of his, later told investigators she had looked for him to join a group photo, but he was nowhere to be found. Another classmate remembered checking the parking lot for a friend's car and not seeing Marcus there, either. Marcus reappeared roughly an hour later, just before 9 p.m. When asked where he'd been, he gave a vague answer about getting some air and dealing with a headache. No one questioned it. Teenagers disappeared at prom, it was chaotic, and it was easy to lose track of time. But in the years that followed, that single hour would become the most scrutinized 60 minutes of Marcus Washington's life. Investigators would eventually reconstruct his timeline with obsessive detail. They would measure the 10-mile drive, calculate the time, and chart every possible route between Stone Mountain High and the parsonage on Memorial Drive. They would conclude that Marcus had just enough time, barely, but just enough, to leave the dance, drive home, commit the murders, clean up, and return. The prom photos would become exhibits. His tuxedo would be examined for blood spatter that was never found. His calm demeanor for the rest of the night would be recast as chillingly cold rather than simply teenage. But on May 20, 1995, none of that had happened. Marcus was just a kid at a dance, watching the clock tick toward midnight. Around him, his classmates celebrated. The music swelled, the lights dimmed for a slow song, and 10 miles away, in a locked house on Memorial Drive, 4 people were dying. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support is what allows us to keep telling these important stories. Sunday morning, May 21st, arrived with an oppressive, sticky stillness. The Washington family was the spine of the New Hope Baptist Church. Elias believed in punctuality as a form of reverence, and Serafina always had the children dressed and ready long before the first hymn. But on this morning, the front row pew reserved for the pastor's family remained starkly empty. At first, the congregation assumed a simple delay. Perhaps one of the girls was sick. Perhaps Serafina was managing a last-minute outfit crisis. But as the minutes ticked past and the 11 a.m. service time came and went, a quiet concern began to spread through the sanctuary. 2 deacons drove to the parsonage. They knocked. No answer. they called out. Silence. One peered through a front window and saw nothing amiss, no sign of a struggle, no hint of distress. But the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy. They called the police. DeKalb County officers arrived within minutes. When no response came, they forced entry through the locked front door. What they found would scar Stone Mountain for decades. Elias Washington lay in the hallway, his body still. Serafina was nearby in the living room, her life taken with the same brutal efficiency. In their separate bedrooms, Amara and Chloe were discovered, their small bodies motionless. All four had been shot. The house was locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no drawers pulled open to suggest a robbery. Just 4 lives, extinguished in the silence. The officers radioed for backup, their voices strained with shock. Within an hour, Memorial Drive was sealed off. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the humid breeze. Neighbors gathered on their porches, their hands covering their mouths, whispering to each other in disbelief. News travels with the speed of grief in a town like Stone Mountain. By noon, everyone knew the pastor and his family were dead. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution would run the headline the next day. Pastor's family slain, community in shock. Inside the house, detectives began their grim task. They photographed every room, cataloged every detail, and searched for the one piece of evidence that would explain the unexplainable. But the scene offered more questions than answers. The family's .22 caliber rifle was missing. There were no unfamiliar fingerprints on the door handles. No bloody footprints leading outside. Whoever had done this had either been meticulously careful, or incredibly lucky. Or they had known the house, and the family, well enough to leave no trace. The forensic team worked through the afternoon, and into the night. Detectives moved with methodical purpose, lifting prints from surfaces, swabbing for gunpowder residue, and mapping the position of each victim. The house felt frozen in time, as though the clock had stopped the moment the first shot was fired. One detective knelt in the hallway, studying the blood spatter on the wall. Another examined the deadbolt on the front door, confirming what they already feared. It had been locked from the inside. That single fact pointed away from a random intruder. Whoever killed the Washingtons had either been let in, or they had a key. The missing rifle became the investigation's first, and only major lead. It was Elias's gun, kept in his study for protection. Its absence suggested this was not an impulsive act. Someone had taken it, used it, and removed it from the scene. But where was it now? And who had taken it? Detectives began interviewing neighbors. Most had heard nothing. The neighborhood was quiet, but not silent. One woman recalled hearing what sounded like car doors around 8 p.m., but she couldn't be sure. Another neighbor mentioned seeing Marcus leave for prom but hadn't noticed his return. The congregation gathered outside the police tape, their faces a mask of grief and confusion. Some prayed quietly, others wept openly. Elias Washington had been their spiritual guide, the man who baptized their children and buried their parents. Serafina had organized the church bake sales. The girls had sung in the children's choir. Losing them felt like the heart had been ripped out of the community. One deacon spoke to a reporter, his voice thick with emotion. This was a family of God. Who could do this to them? Who could take them from us? The question echoed through Stone Mountain, unanswered. Inside the police station, the lead detective sat at his desk, reviewing the initial reports. No forced entry. No robbery. No witnesses. The locked house screamed intimacy. Someone the family knew, someone they trusted. But the brutality screamed rage, a deep, personal, and terrifying fury. The detective circled one name in his notes, Marcus Washington. The son had been at prom. Dozens of witnesses confirmed it. But that unaccounted for hour gnawed at the detective. Where had Marcus gone? And why was his alibi so weak? For now, there wasn't enough to bring him in. Just a deep-seated suspicion. Just a hunch. The detective closed the file and stared out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, a killer was walking free, and the clock was ticking. The funeral was held on a Thursday afternoon, 5 days after the murders. The New Hope Baptist Church overflowed. Mourners stood in the back, packed the aisles, and spilled out onto the front steps, listening to the service through speakers. The entire community, it seemed, had come to say goodbye. 4 caskets sat at the front of the sanctuary: Elias's, Seraphina's, Amara's, and Chloe's. Flowers surrounded them in waves of white and red. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and sorrow. Marcus sat in the front row, surrounded by relatives. His face was stoic, his expression unreadable. Some in the congregation watched him with profound sympathy, seeing a young man utterly broken by loss. Others watched him with a different, quieter emotion, a creeping, terrible suspicion. Why wasn't he crying? The question would be asked later, whispered in kitchens and at Bible study. People remembered how Marcus had stood apart at the viewing, his hands clasped, his gaze distant. They remembered how he accepted condolences with polite nods, but offered no emotion of his own. To some, it looked like profound shock. To others, it looked like guilt. The pastor who delivered the eulogy spoke of a faith tested by fire, of a family called home too soon, of trusting in God's plan even when it felt senseless. His words were meant to comfort, but they landed like stones. How could there be a plan for this? How could a father, a mother, and 2 small children be part of any divine design? After the service, the congregation filed past the caskets one last time. Marcus stood at the end, shaking hands, accepting hugs. A few people lingered, wanting to say something to fill the void, but finding no words big enough. One church elder, an older woman who had known Elias for years, pulled Marcus aside. "I'm praying for you, child. I'm praying for the truth to be revealed." Marcus looked at her, his eyes flat. "Thank you, ma'am." She walked away, unsettled, though she couldn't say why. Outside, plainclothes detectives stood at a distance, watching. They had learned that funerals were often crucibles of truth. Guilt had a way of showing itself in grief, or in the lack of it. They watched Marcus climb into a car with an uncle. They watched the mourners disperse. They watched the church empty, leaving only the echo of unanswered prayers. Back at the station, the lead detective added a new note to the growing file. Suspect behavior observed at funerals. Detachment. Lack of visible emotion. Requires further investigation. But investigation required evidence, and evidence remained maddeningly absent. The case was marked inactive within weeks. The file was placed in a metal cabinet, joining the rows of other unsolved homicides that lined the cold case room. Detectives moved on to new crimes, fresh leads. Stone Mountain tried to heal, but the wound was too deep, and the questions never stopped. The 1990s faded into the new millennium. The parsonage on Memorial Drive stood empty for years, its windows dark, its rooms silent. No one wanted to live in the house where the Washingtons had died. Children in the neighborhood grew up hearing the story as a ghost tale, a reminder that monsters were real and could live right next door. Marcus Washington became a phantom in the town's memory. The son who had lost everything, the teenager whose name was spoken with equal parts pity and doubt. Marcus himself moved away, trying to build a life out of the ashes. He attended college in another state, found work, and avoided Stone Mountain. But the shadow of suspicion followed him. Without charges, he was free, but he was never truly free. A surviving cousin, Maya, grew up in the care of relatives. She had been only 9 years old the night her family was killed, staying with her grandmother just 2 streets over. For years, she struggled to recall details. Therapists told her not to force the memories, to let them surface on their own. But as Maya grew into a woman, fragments began to return. She remembered the arguments between her uncle Elias and Marcus. She remembered the suffocating tension that filled the house in the weeks before the murders. She remembered being afraid, though she couldn't articulate why. In quiet moments, Maya prayed for clarity. She prayed for justice. And she prayed for peace, even though she wasn't sure what that would look like. Meanwhile, the case file gathered dust in the cold case room. Detectives would occasionally pull it, review the notes, and place it back on the shelf. There was nothing new. The missing rifle had never been found. No new witnesses had come forward. The timeline remained a tight, circumstantial knot. The Washington murder seemed destined to remain one of Georgia's most haunting mysteries, a tragedy without an answer, a wound that refused to close. But in 2009, something changed. A new detective, assigned to review cold cases with fresh eyes and new technology, opened the Washington file. He read through the reports, unburdened by the frustration of the original investigators. He reconstructed the timeline, mapped the drive, and recalculated the possibilities. And he came to the same conclusion the original detectives had suspected but could never prove. Marcus Washington was the only person who could have committed the murders. The detective brought his findings to the DeKalb County District Attorney's office. They reviewed the evidence together. The prom timeline. The locked house. The missing rifle. The lack of forced entry. None of it was a smoking gun. All of it was deeply suggestive. The DA made the decision. 14 years after the murders, they would charge Marcus Washington. Stone Mountain awoke to the news on a cool morning in late 2009. The headlines confirmed what many had whispered for over a decade. Pastor's son arrested for 1995 family slayings. The case that had gone ice cold was suddenly on fire. The charging documents were filed in DeKalb County Superior Court. 4 counts of murder. Each one carried the weight of a life stolen. Marcus Washington, now 31 years old, was arrested at his apartment in Atlanta. His neighbors watched as police led him away in handcuffs, his face calm, his eyes betraying the shock of a man who thought the past was finally buried. The district attorney held a press conference that afternoon. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones extended. The DA stood at the podium, composed and resolute. After 14 years of investigation, he began. We believe we have sufficient evidence to bring justice to the Washington family. This case is built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence, motive, opportunity, and timeline. We believe Marcus Washington murdered his father, mother, and 2 young sisters on the night of May 20, 1995, and then attended his high school prom as if nothing had happened. The words hung in the humid air, stark and damning. Reporters shouted questions. What new evidence do you have? Is there a confession? How can you prove this after so many years? The DA held up a hand for silence. We are confident in our case. The details will be presented in court. For now, we ask the community to trust the process and allow justice to move forward. The public defender assigned to represent Marcus issued a statement later that day. His tone was measured but firm. This is a case built on speculation, not proof. There is no physical evidence linking Marcus Washington to these crimes. No weapon, no fingerprints, no DNA. We will vigorously defend him against these charges, and we believe the truth will prevail. Stone Mountain was once again torn in two. Some residents felt a profound sense of relief. Finally, after all these years, someone was being held accountable. The pastor's family would have justice. The case would finally be closed. Others felt a deep unease. How could someone be charged with 4 counts of murder based on circumstantial evidence alone? What if the DA was wrong? What if Marcus Washington was innocent? Jury selection began in early 2011. The courtroom in DeKalb County was packed every day. Selecting an impartial jury proved to be a challenge. Nearly everyone in the area had heard of the Washington murders. The case had become a dark legend. After 2 weeks, a jury of 12 was seated. On the morning of the trial's first day, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Marcus sat at the defense table in a dark suit, his face an unreadable mask. Maya sat in the front row, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on her cousin. The prosecutor rose. May 20, 1995. A father tells his son he can attend his prom, but he sets rules. The son, 17 years old, feels suffocated. He wants freedom. And so, on the night that should have been a celebration, he makes a choice. A choice that annihilates his family. He laid out the state's case, motive, opportunity, and means. We will show you that he left his prom for an unaccounted for hour, just enough time to drive home, kill his family, and return to the dance. We will show you that no one else could have done this. Then the defense attorney stood. The prosecution just told you a story, he began. A tragic, awful story. But a story is not evidence. A story is not proof. And in this courtroom, proof is the only thing that matters. He hammered on the facts. No fingerprints. No blood. No weapon. No confession. No physical evidence of any kind. What the prosecution has is a theory. A timeline. A suspicion. But suspicion is not guilt. And in America, we do not convict people based on suspicion. The prosecution's case unfolded. A former classmate testified about Marcus's behavior at prom. He seemed normal, she said. But looking back, maybe too normal. A forensic expert testified about the timeline. He demonstrated that Marcus could have driven from the high school to his home, committed the murders, and returned to prom within the unaccounted for hour. It's tight, the expert admitted under cross-examination. But it's possible. Possible, the defense attorney echoed. But not proven. Correct? Correct. The most anticipated moment came when Marcus Washington took the stand. His attorney began gently. Marcus, can you tell the jury what happened on May 20th, 1995? I went to prom, Marcus said, his voice steady. And at prom, you left for about an hour. Where did you go? Marcus hesitated. I stepped outside. I just needed some air. I was stressed. About the curfew, about everything. I just walked around the parking lot for a while. Did you go home? No. Did you kill your family? Marcus's voice cracked, just slightly. No. I loved them. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. Isn't it true, Mr. Washington, that you felt suffocated by your father's rules? I was frustrated sometimes. But I didn't hate him. Isn't it true you wanted freedom? I was 17. Of course I wanted independence. And isn't it true that on May 20th, 1995, you decided to take that freedom, by any means necessary? No. That's not true. Then explain to this jury why you can't account for that hour. Explain why you were the only person with access to the house. Explain why no one else on earth had a motive. The objection was sustained, but the question hung in the air. Closing arguments arrived after 3 long weeks. The prosecutor approached the jury with confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about accountability. For 14 years, Marcus Washington has lived his life while his family has lain in their graves. The defense wants you to believe that the lack of physical evidence means innocence. But ask yourselves, who else could have done this? He pointed to the timeline, the locked doors, the missing rifle. He killed his father because he was tired of the rules. He killed his mother because she was a witness. And he killed 2 innocent little girls because they were there. Then he went back to his prom and smiled for the cameras. Justice has waited 14 years. Don't make it wait another day. The defense attorney's closing was quieter but no less passionate. The prosecution has built a house of cards. No weapon. No blood. No fingerprints. No confession. They are asking you to convict a man based on a story. He looked at each juror. But this is not a story. This is a man's life. And the burden of proof is on the state. Beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have doubt, any doubt, you must acquit. Because in this country, we do not convict people on suspicion. We convict them on proof. And the proof simply isn't there. The judge instructed the jury, and they were dismissed to deliberate. Hours turned into days. The jury sent out notes, requesting to review testimony, asking to see the prom photos again. Each note sent a jolt of anxiety through both sides. On the 3rd day, the jury sent word they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled within minutes. Marcus was brought in, his face pale. The families took their seats, the tension in the room so thick it was hard to breathe. The jury filed in. The judge asked the foreperson to stand. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the death of Elias Washington, how do you find? Guilty. A sharp gasp cut through the courtroom. Maya closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. On the charge of murder in the death of Serafina Washington, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of murder in the death of Amara Washington, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of murder in the death of Chloe Washington, how do you find? Guilty. Marcus's face remained impassive, but his hands trembled violently on the table. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing. Marcus was led away in handcuffs. Outside, the DA addressed the media. Justice has been served. The Washington family can finally rest in peace. Inside, the defense attorney filed a notice of appeal. The fight was far from over. At sentencing, the judge was grim. Mr. Washington, you have been found guilty of 4 counts of murder. The damage you have caused is immeasurable. He paused. On each count, I sentence you to 40 years. These sentences will run consecutively. A total sentence of 160 years. The number hung in the air. A lifetime, and then some. Marcus was transported to a maximum security facility that afternoon. The trial was over. The verdict was in. The story, it seemed, had finally reached its end. But stories like this never truly end. They just echo. The first appeal was filed within months. Marcus's new attorney argued ineffective counsel, claiming the public defender had failed to adequately challenge the prosecution's purely circumstantial case. The appellate court reviewed the transcripts and issued their ruling, appeal denied. The court found that while the evidence was circumstantial, it was sufficient for a jury to reach a guilty verdict. Marcus's legal team regrouped and filed again, this time focusing on the timeline, arguing the tight but possible window was, in fact, impossible. The court reviewed and again denied. With each denial, Marcus's hope dimmed, but he refused to stop fighting. Letters flowed from his prison cell to lawyers, to advocacy groups, to journalists. He told his story again and again, insisting on his innocence. Wrongful conviction organizations began to take notice. They reviewed the case file and saw what Marcus's defenders had always seen, a conviction built on a story, not on proof. In the mid-2010s, true crime media exploded. Podcasts, documentaries, and streaming services turned cold cases into national obsessions. The Washington murders, with its mix of family tragedy, religious fervor, and a conviction based on nothing tangible, became a popular subject. The Southern Gothic podcast devoted an entire season to the case. The host interviewed former investigators, legal experts, and Marcus himself, his voice thin over a prison phone line. The podcast meticulously reconstructed the timeline, highlighting inconsistencies and raising profound questions. Could Marcus really have committed 4 murders, cleaned up, and returned to prom in under an hour? The host asked. The state says yes. But when we mapped it ourselves, we found the timeline to be impossibly tight. Listeners were galvanized. Some were convinced of Marcus's innocence. Others remained certain of his guilt. The debate raged on social media, with both sides using the exact same set of facts to support opposite conclusions. Major networks aired specials on the case. They interviewed Maya, who remained steadfast in her belief that justice had been served. I remember the tension, Maya said on camera, her voice steady. I remember being afraid. And I remember that my cousin was the only one who could have done this. The jury saw the evidence. I trust their decision. The programs also featured Marcus's prison interview. His face had aged, the years of incarceration etching lines around his eyes. But his message was unchanged. I didn't do this, he said quietly. I lost my family, and then I lost my freedom. I understand why people have doubts, because the evidence isn't there. It never was. The media attention breathed new life into the case, but it didn't change the legal reality. Courts don't retry cases based on podcasts. They require new evidence. And the evidence was gone. Wrongful conviction movements embraced Marcus's case as a symbol of a broken system. But for every supporter, there was a skeptic. Victims' rights groups argued that Marcus had received a fair trial and that overturning the verdict would be a deep dishonor to the memory of Elias, Serafina, Amara, and Chloe. Marcus, now in his late 40s, has spent more years in prison than he had spent free. His insistence on his innocence has never wavered. The case files became a case study in circumstantial evidence, pored over by law students. This case asks a fundamental question. One professor told his class. How much proof is enough? And who gets to decide? Back in Stone Mountain, the story lives in quieter ways. The old parsonage has been sold, repainted, and occupied by a new family. The church holds an annual memorial service. But the questions never fully disappeared. Decades after the murders, the story remains unresolved in the hearts of those who lived it. Marcus maintains his innocence from behind bars. Maya maintains her faith in the verdict. And the truth, whatever it was, remains locked in the silence of that May night, buried somewhere between what was proven and what was believed, between justice delivered and certainty forever out of reach.